On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which began in 2014. The invasion has likely resulted in tens of thousands of deaths on both sides and caused Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II, with an estimated 8 million people being displaced within the country by late May as well as 7.7 million Ukrainians fleeing the country as of October 18, 2022. Within 5 weeks of the invasion, Russia experienced its greatest emigration since the 1917 October Revolution. The invasion has also caused global food shortages. Following the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution, Russia annexed Crimea, and Russian-backed paramilitaries seized part of the Donbas region of southeastern Ukraine, which consists of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, sparking a regional war. In March 2021, Russia began a large military build-up along its border with Ukraine, amassing up to 190,000 troops and their equipment. Despite the build-up, denials of plans to invade or attack Ukraine were issued by various Russian government officials up to the day before the invasion. On February 21, 2022, Russia recognized the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, two self-proclaimed breakaway quasi-states in the Donbas. The next day, the Federation Council of Russia authorized the use of military force and Russian troops entered both territories. The invasion began on the morning of February 24, when Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. In his address, Putin espoused irredentist views, challenged Ukraine's right to statehood, and falsely claimed Ukraine was governed by neo-Nazis who persecuted the ethnic Russian minority. Minutes later, missiles, rockets and airstrikes hit across Ukraine, including the capital Kyiv, followed by a large ground invasion from multiple directions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky enacted martial law and a general mobilization. Russian attacks were initially launched on a northern front from Belarus towards Kyiv, a northeastern front towards Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from Luhansk and Donetsk. Russia's advance towards Kyiv stalled in March, with Russian troops retreating from the northern front by April. On the southern and southeastern fronts, Russia captured Kherson in March and then Mariupol in May after a siege. On April 19, Russia launched a renewed attack on the Donbas region, with Luhansk Oblast fully captured by July 3. Russian forces continued to bomb both military and civilian targets far from the front line. Ukrainian forces launched counter-offensives in the south in August, and in the northeast in September. Soon after, Russia announced the illegal annexation of 4 partially occupied Ukrainian oblasts. The invasion has received widespread international condemnation. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the invasion and demanding a full withdrawal of Russian forces. The International Court of Justice ordered Russia to suspend military operations and the Council of Europe expelled Russia. Many countries imposed sanctions on Russia, as well as on its ally Belarus, which have affected the economies of Russia and the world, and provided humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine, totaling over $80 billion from 40 countries as of August 2022. Protests occurred around the world. Those in Russia were met with mass arrests and increased media censorship, including a ban on the words war and invasion. Over 1,000 companies have pulled out of Russia and Belarus in response to the invasion. The International Criminal Court has opened an investigation into crimes against humanity in Ukraine since 2013, including war crimes in the 2022 invasion. Background: after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the newly independent republics of Ukraine and Russia maintained ties. Ukraine agreed in 1994 to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and dismantle the nuclear weapons in Ukraine left by the USSR. In return, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States agreed in the Budapest Memorandum to uphold the territorial integrity of Ukraine. In 1999, Russia signed the Charter for European Security, which reaffirmed the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties of alliance. After the Soviet Union collapsed, several former Eastern Bloc countries joined NATO, partly due to regional security threats such as the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis, the war in Abkhazia and the First Chechen War. Russian leaders claimed Western powers pledged that NATO would not expand eastward, although this is disputed. Following the Euromaidan protests and the Revolution of Dignity which resulted in the removal of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014, pro-Russian unrest erupted in eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. Russian soldiers without insignia took control of strategic positions and infrastructure in the Ukrainian territory of Crimea, and seized the Crimean parliament. Russia organized a controversial referendum, whose outcome was for Crimea to join Russia. Russia's annexation of Crimea followed in March 2014, then the war in Donbass, which began in April 2014 with the formation of two Russia-backed separatist quasi-states, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Russian troops were involved in the conflict. The Minsk agreements signed in September 2014 and February 2015 were a bid to stop the fighting, but ceasefires repeatedly failed. A dispute emerged over the role of Russia. Normandy format members France, Germany, and Ukraine saw Minsk as an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, whereas Russia insisted Ukraine should negotiate directly with the two separatist republics. In 2021, Putin refused offers from Zelensky to hold high-level talks, and the Russian government subsequently endorsed an article by former President Dmitry Medvedev arguing it was pointless to deal with Ukraine while it remained a vassal of the US. The annexation of Crimea led to a new wave of Russian nationalism, with much of the Russian neo-imperial movement aspiring to annex more Ukrainian land, including the unrecognized Novorossiya. Analyst Vladimir Sikor argued that Putin's 2014 speech after the annexation of Crimea was a de facto manifesto of Greater Russia irredentism. In July 2021, Putin published an essay titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, reaffirming that Russians and Ukrainians were one people. American historian Timothy Snyder described Putin's ideas as imperialism. British journalist Edward Lucas described it as historical revisionism. Other observers have noted that the Russian leadership has a distorted view of modern Ukraine and its history. Prelude and declaration of military operations. In March and April 2021, Russia began a major military build-up near the Russo-Ukrainian border. A second build-up followed from October 2021 to February 2022. In both Russia and Belarus. Members of the Russian government repeatedly denied having plans to invade or attack Ukraine, including government spokesman Dmitry Peskov on November 28, 2021, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov on January 19, 2022, Russian Ambassador to the U.S. Anatoly Antonov on February 20, 2022, and Russian Ambassador to the Czech Republic Alexander Zimevsky on February 23, 2022. Putin's chief national security advisor, Nikolai Patrushev, believed that the West had been in an undeclared war with Russia for years. Russia's updated national security strategy, published in May 2021, said that Russia may use forceful methods to thwart or avert unfriendly actions that threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. Sources say the decision to invade Ukraine was made by Putin and a small group of war hawks in Putin's inner circle, including Patrushev and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. During the second build-up, Russia demanded that the US and NATO enter into a legally binding arrangement preventing Ukraine from ever joining NATO, and remove multinational forces from NATO's Eastern European member states. Russia threatened an unspecified military response if NATO followed an aggressive line. These demands were widely seen as non-viable. New NATO members in Central and Eastern Europe had joined the alliance because they preferred the safety and economic opportunities offered by NATO and the EU, and their governments sought protection from Russian irredentism. A formal treaty to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO would contravene the treaty's open-door policy, despite NATO's unenthusiastic response to Ukrainian requests to join. Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz made efforts to prevent the war in February. Macron met with Putin but failed to convince him not to go forward with the attack. Scholz warned Putin about heavy sanctions that would be imposed should he invade Ukraine. Scholz, in trying to negotiate a settlement, also told Zelensky to renounce aspirations to join NATO and declare neutrality. However, Zelensky said Putin could not be trusted to uphold such an agreement. On February 24, before 5 a.m. Kyiv time, Putin announced a special military operation in eastern Ukraine and effectively declared war on Ukraine. In his speech, Putin said he had no plans to occupy Ukrainian territory and that he supported the right of the Ukrainian people to self-determination. He said the purpose of the operation was to protect the people in the predominantly Russian-speaking region of Donbass, who he falsely claimed that for 8 years now, been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kyiv regime. Putin said that Russia sought for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Within minutes of Putin's announcement, explosions were reported in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and the Donbass region. An alleged leaked report from within the FSB claimed that the intelligence agency was not warned of Putin's plan to invade Ukraine. Immediately following the attack, Zelensky declared martial law in Ukraine. The same evening, he ordered a general mobilization of all Ukrainian males between 18 and 60 years old who were prohibited from leaving the country. Russian troops entered Ukraine from the north in Belarus, from the northeast in Russia, from the east in the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, and from the south in Crimea. Russian equipment and vehicles were marked with a white Z military symbol, believed to be a measure to prevent friendly fire. Invasion and resistance. The invasion began at dawn of February 24, with infantry divisions and armored and air support in eastern Ukraine, and dozens of missile attacks across both eastern Ukraine and western Ukraine. The first fighting took place in Luhansk Oblast near Milov village on the border with Russia at 3:40 a.m. Kyiv time. The main infantry and tank attacks were launched in 4 spearhead incursions, creating a northern front launched towards Kyiv, a southern front originating in Crimea, a southeastern front launched at the cities of Luhansk and Donbass, and an eastern front. Dozens of missile strikes across Ukraine reached as far west as Lviv. Wagner Group mercenaries and Chechen forces reportedly made several attempts to assassinate Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian government said these efforts were thwarted by anti-war officials in Russia's Federal Security Service, who shared intelligence of the plans. The Russian invasion was unexpectedly met by fierce Ukrainian resistance. In Kyiv, Russia failed to take the city as its attacks were repulsed at the suburbs during the battles of Irpin, Hostomel, and Bucha. The Russian army tried to encircle the capital, but Ukrainian forces managed to hold ground and put to effective use Western arms, including Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, stretching thin Russian supply lines and stalling the offensive. On March 9, a column of Russian tanks and armored vehicles was ambushed in Brovary, suffered heavy losses and was forced to retreat. On the northern front, the Russian army adopted siege tactics to the key cities of Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv but failed to capture them due to stiff resistance and logistical setbacks. On the southern front, Russian forces captured the major city of Kherson on March 2. In Mykolaiv Oblast, it advanced as far as Voznesensk but was repelled to south of Mykolaiv. On March 25, the Russian Defense Ministry said the first stage of the military operation in Ukraine was generally complete, that the Ukrainian military forces had suffered serious losses, and the Russian military would now concentrate on the liberation of Donbass. The first stage of the invasion was conducted on 4 fronts, including one towards western Kyiv from Belarus, conducted by the Russian Eastern Military District, comprising the 29th, 35th, and 36th Combined Arms Armies. A second axis deployed towards eastern Kyiv from Russia by the Central Military District, comprised the 41st Combined Arms Army and 2nd Guards Combined Arms Army. A third axis deployed towards Kharkiv by the Western Military District, with the 1st Guards Tank Army and 20th Combined Arms Army. A fourth, southern, front originating in occupied Crimea and Russia's Rostov Oblast with an eastern axis towards Odessa and a western area of operations toward Mariupol was opened by the Southern Military District, including the 58th, 49th, and 8th Combined Arms Army, the latter also commanding the 1st and 2nd Army Corps of the Russian separatist forces in Donbass. By April 7, Russian troops deployed to the northern front by the Russian Eastern Military District pulled back from the Kyiv offensive, apparently to resupply and then redeploy to the Donbass region to reinforce the renewed invasion of southeastern Ukraine. The northeastern front, including the Central Military District, was similarly withdrawn for resupply and redeployment to southeastern Ukraine. By April 8, General Alexander Dvornikov was placed in charge of military operations during the invasion. On April 18, retired Lieutenant General Douglas Lute, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, reported in a PBS NewsHour interview that Russia had repositioned its troops to initiate a new assault on eastern Ukraine, which would be limited to Russia's original deployment of 150,000 to 190,000 troops for the invasion, though the troops were being well supplied from adequate weapon stockpiles in Russia. For Lute, this contrasted sharply with the vast size of the Ukrainian conscription of all male Ukrainian citizens between 16 and 60 years of age, but without adequate weapons in Ukraine's highly limited stockpiles of weapons. On April 26, delegates of the US and 40 allied nations met at Ramstein Air Base in Germany to discuss forming a coalition to provide economic support and military supplies and refitting to Ukraine. Following Putin's Victory Day speech in early May, U.S. Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines said no short-term resolution to the invasion should be expected. Russian forces improved their focus on protecting their supply lines by advancing more slowly, and more methodically. They also benefited from centralizing command under General Dvornikov. Ukraine's reliance on Western-supplied equipment constrained it, as Western countries feared that Ukraine would use it to strike targets in Russia. Military experts disagreed on the future of the conflict. Some suggested Ukraine to trade territory for peace, while others assessed that Ukraine could sustain its resistance to the invasion, due to the Russian losses. On May 26, 2022, the Conflict Intelligence Team, citing Russian soldiers, reported that Colonel General Gennady Zhidko had been put in charge of Russian forces during the invasion, replacing Army General Dvornikov. By May 30, disparities between Russian and Ukrainian artillery were apparent, with Ukrainian artillery being vastly outgunned by range and number. In response to Biden's indication that enhanced artillery would be provided to Ukraine, Putin indicated that Russia would expand its invasion front to include new cities in Ukraine, and in apparent retribution ordered a missile strike against Kyiv on June 6 after not directly attacking the city for several weeks. On June 10, 2022, Vadim Skibitsky, deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence, stated during the Severodonetsk campaign that the front lines were where the future of the invasion would be decided. This is an artillery war now, and we are losing in terms of artillery. Everything now depends on what gives us. Ukraine has one artillery piece to 10 to 15 Russian artillery pieces. Our Western partners have given us about 10% of what they have. On June 29, Reuters reported that Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, updating U.S. intelligence assessment of the Russian invasion, said that U.S. intelligence agencies agree that the invasion will continue for an extended period of time. In short, the picture remains pretty grim and Russia's attitude toward the West is hardening. On July 5, BBC reported that extensive destruction by the Russian invasion would cause immense financial damage to Ukraine's reconstruction economy, stating, Ukraine needs $750 billion for a recovery plan and Russian oligarchs should contribute to the cost, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has told a reconstruction conference in Switzerland. First phase, invasion of Ukraine. The invasion began on February 24, launched out of Belarus to target Kyiv, and from the northeast against the city of Kharkiv. The southeastern front was conducted as two separate spearheads, from Crimea and the southeast against Luhansk and Donetsk. Northern Front, Northeastern Front, Southern Front, Eastern Front. Second phase, Southeastern Front. On April 8, the Russian ministry announced that all troops and divisions in southeastern Ukraine would unite under General Alexander Dvornikov, who was placed in charge of combined military operations, including the units redeployed from the Northern Front and Northeastern Fronts. By April 17, Russian progress on the Southeastern Front appeared to be impeded by opposing Ukrainian forces in the large, heavily fortified Azovstal steel mill and surrounding area in Mariupol. On April 19, the New York Times confirmed that Russia had launched a renewed invasion front referred to as an eastern assault across a 300-mile front extending from Kharkiv to Donetsk and Luhansk, with simultaneous missile attacks again directed at Kyiv in the north and Lviv in western Ukraine. As of April 30, a NATO official described Russian advances as uneven and minor. An anonymous U.S. defense official called the Russian offensive very tepid, minimal at best, and anemic. On May 26, the Conflict Intelligence Team, citing Russian soldiers, reported that Colonel General Gennady Zhidko had been put in charge of Russian forces during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, replacing Army General Dvornikov. However, on June 5 Ukrainian governor of Luhansk Serhiy Haidai said Dvornikov was still in command and had been given until June 10 by his superiors to complete the reduction of Severodonetsk. In June 2022 the chief spokesman for the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation Igor Konashenkov revealed that Russian troops are divided between the Army Group's center commanded by Colonel General Alexander Lapin and south commanded by Army General Sergei Surovikin. On July 20, Lavrov announced that Russia would respond to the increased military aid being received by Ukraine from abroad as justifying the expansion of its special military operation to include objectives in both the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. Mykolaiv-Odessa Front, Dnipro-Zaporizhzhia Front, Fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, Fall of Mariupol. Third phase, counter-offensives and annexations. None. Annexations. Kherson counter-offensive. Kharkiv counter-offensive. Dnipro-Zaporizhzhia Front. Events in Crimea. On July 31, 2022, Russian Navy Day commemorations were cancelled after a drone attack reportedly wounded several people at the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol. On August 9, 2022, there were large explosions reported at Saki Air Base in western Crimea. Satellite imagery showed that at least 8 aircraft were damaged or destroyed. The cause of the explosions is unknown, but may have been long-range missiles, sabotage by special forces or an accident, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhnyi claimed on September 7 that it had been a Ukrainian missile attack. The base is located near the town of Novoftorivka, which is popular with tourists. Queues to leave the area formed at the Crimean Bridge after the explosions. A week later there were explosions and a fire at an arms depot near Jankoy in northeastern Crimea, which Russia blamed on sabotage. A railway line and power station were also damaged. According to the Russian regional head, Sergei Aksyonov, 2,000 people were evacuated from the area. On August 18, explosions were reported at Belbek Air Base, north of Sevastopol. On the morning of October 8, the Kerch Bridge, which links occupied Crimea with Russia, was hit by a large explosion which collapsed part of the roadway and caused damage to the railway line. Missile attacks and air war. On March 14, Russian forces conducted multiple cruise missile attacks on a military training facility in Lvov, Lviv Oblast, close to the Polish border. Local governor Maxim Kozytsky reported that at least 35 people had been killed. On March 18, Russia expanded the attack to Lviv, with Ukrainian military officials saying initial information suggested that the missiles which hit Lviv were likely air-launched cruise missiles originating from warplanes flying over the Black Sea. On May 16, U.S. defense officials say that in the previous 24 hours Russians fired long-range missiles targeting military training facility near Lviv. On February 24, Russian forces attacked the Chawiv Air Base, which housed Bayraktar TB2 drones. The attack caused damage to fuel storage areas and infrastructure. The next day, Ukrainian forces attacked the Milaravo Air Base. On February 27, Russia reportedly fired 9 K-720 Iskander missiles from Belarus at the civilians' Haidomir airport. Many Ukrainian air defense facilities were destroyed or damaged in the first days of the invasion by Russian air strikes. In the opening days of the conflict, Russia fired many cruise and ballistic missiles at the principal Ukrainian ground-based early warning radars, thereby blinding the Ukrainian Air Force to their air activity. Craters in the operating surfaces at the major Ukrainian air bases hindered Ukrainian aircraft movements, and several Ukrainian long-range S-300P surface-to-air missile batteries were destroyed. On March 1, Russia and the U.S. established a deconfliction line to avoid any misunderstanding that could cause an unintentional escalation. Russia lost at least 10 aircraft on March 5. On March 6, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that 88 Russian aircraft had been destroyed since the war began. However, an anonymous senior U.S. defense official told Reuters on March 7 that Russia still had the vast majority of its fighter jets and helicopters that had been amassed near Ukraine available to fly. After the first month of the invasion, Justin Bronk, a British military observer, counted the Russian aircraft losses at 15 fixed-wing aircraft and 35 helicopters, but noted that the true total was certainly higher. In contrast, according to the United States, 49 Ukrainian fighter aircraft were lost by 18 March. On March 11, U.S. officials said that Russian aircraft launched up to 200 sorties a day, most not entering Ukrainian airspace, instead staying in Russian airspace. On March 13, Russian forces conducted multiple cruise missile attacks on a military training facility in Lvov, Lviv Oblast, close to the Polish border. Local governor Maxim Kozytsky reported that at least 35 people had been killed in the attacks. The poor performance of the Russian Air Force has been attributed by The Economist to Russia's inability to suppress Ukraine's medium-range surface-to-air missile batteries and Russia's lack of precision-guided bombs. Ukrainian mid-range SAM sites force planes to fly low, making them vulnerable to Stinger and other shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles, and lack of training and flight hours for Russian pilots renders them inexperienced for the type of close ground support missions typical of modern air forces. On May 5, Forbes magazine reported that Russians had continued air attacks and continue to send Su-24 and Su-25 attack planes on treetop-level bombing runs targeting Ukrainian positions. By June 2022, Russia had not achieved air superiority, having lost around 165 of its combat aircraft over Ukraine, which amounted to approximately 10% of its frontline combat strength. Western commentators noted the qualitative and quantitative advantages the Russian Air Force had over its Ukrainian counterpart, but attributed the poor performance of Russian aviation to the extensive ground-based anti-aircraft capabilities of the Ukrainians. An attack on Dnipro proper was carried out by Russian armed forces on July 15, 2022. As a result, 4 people died and 16 were injured. The main target was the largest space plant of Ukraine located within the city. The city was struck by X-101 missiles launched from Tu-95 aircraft in the northern part of the Caspian Sea. According to preliminary data, 8 missiles were launched, of which 4 were shot down by the Ukrainian Air Defense Forces. Each missile costs $13 million. Part of the rockets hit the Pyvidinmish enterprise. As a result of the impact, the city's water supply was damaged, and part of the city's residents were left without water supply. More than 10 cars were damaged, doors and windows were destroyed in residential buildings. 4 people were killed. One of the victims was a city bus driver. On the first day, 15 wounded were reported, and the next day their number increased to 16. In August, the U.S. Air Force was able to integrate AGM-88 HARM missiles into the Ukrainian Su-27S and MiG-29S. This effort has taken some months to achieve. This does not give the Ukrainian Air Force the same capabilities that it would on an F-16. However, U.S. Air Force General James B. Hecker said, "Even though you don't get a kinetic kill, you can get local air superiority for a period of time where you can do what you need to do." On September 19, U.S. Air Force General James B. Hecker said that 55 Russian military aircraft had been shot down by Ukrainian air defenses since the start of the invasion. He credited this success to the Ukrainian use of SA-11 and SA-10 air defense systems. As the U.S. does not have these systems, getting new missiles from European allies is a big ask from Kyiv. Russian airplanes increased their operations in response to the 2022 Ukrainian Kharkiv Oblast counter-offensive. The tally of downed aircraft increased to 55 when the UK MOD stated that it believed that some 4 Russian jets had been downed by Ukraine over the previous 10 days. These losses were due to changing front lines and other factors. Also, Russian aviation resources were under pressure to provide closer support to ground forces. As of September 19, the Ukrainian Air Force was at about 80% of its pre-invasion strength after 7 months of combat. Naval blockade and engagements. Ukraine lies on the Black Sea, which has ocean access only through the Turkish-held Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. On February 28, Turkey invoked the 1936 Montreux Convention and sealed off the straits to Russian warships not registered to Black Sea home bases and not returning to their ports of origin. This prevented the passage of 4 Russian naval vessels through the Turkish straits in late February. On February 24, the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine announced that an attack on Snake Island by Russian Navy ships had begun. The guided missile cruiser Moskva and patrol boat Vasily Bykov bombarded the island with their deck guns. When the Russian warship identified itself and instructed the Ukrainian soldiers stationed on the island to surrender, their response was, "Russian warship, go fuck yourself." After the bombardment, a detachment of Russian soldiers landed and took control of Snake Island. Russia stated on February 26 that U.S. drones supplied intelligence to the Ukrainian Navy to help target Russian warships in the Black Sea, which the U.S. denied. By March 3, the Ukrainian frigate Hetman Sahaydakhny, the flagship of the Ukrainian Navy, was scuttled in Mykolaiv to prevent its capture by Russian forces. On March 14, the Russian source RT reported that the Russian armed forces had captured about a dozen Ukrainian ships in Berdyansk, including the Polnichny-class landing ship Yuri Olafirenko. On March 24, Ukrainian officials said that a Russian landing ship docked in Berdyansk, initially reported to be the Orsk and then its sister ship, the Saratov, was destroyed by a Ukrainian rocket attack. In March 2022, the UN International Maritime Organization sought to create a safe sea corridor for commercial vessels to leave Ukrainian ports. On March 27, Russia established a sea corridor 80 miles long and 3 miles wide through its maritime exclusion zone, for the transit of merchant vessels from the edge of Ukrainian territorial waters southeast of Odessa. Ukraine closed its ports at Marsek Level 3, with sea mines laid in port approaches, until the end to hostilities. The Russian cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, was, according to Ukrainian sources and a U.S. senior official, hit on April 13 by 2 Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, setting the ship on fire. The Russian Defense Ministry confirmed the warship had suffered serious damage due to a munition explosion caused by a fire, and said that its entire crew had been evacuated. The Pentagon spokesman John Kirby reported on April 14 that satellite images showed that the Russian warship had suffered a sizable explosion on board but was heading to the east for expected repairs and refitting in Sevastopol. Later on the same day, the Russian Ministry of Defense stated that Moskva had sunk while under tow in rough weather. On April 15, Reuters reported that Russia launched an apparent retaliatory missile strike against the missile factory Luk Design Bureau in Kyiv, where the Neptune missiles used in the Moskva attack were manufactured and designed. On May 5, a U.S. official confirmed that the U.S. gave a range of intelligence to assist in the sinking of the Russian cruiser Moskva. In early May, Ukrainian forces launched counterattacks on Snake Island. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have repelled these counterattacks. Ukraine released footage of a Russian Cerna-class landing craft located in the Black Sea being destroyed near Snake Island by a Ukrainian drone. The same day, a pair of Ukrainian Su-27 conducted a high-speed, low-level bombing run on Russian-occupied Snake Island. The attack was captured on film by a Baykar Bayraktar TB2 drone. On June 1, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov asserted that Ukraine's policy of mining its own harbors to impede Russian maritime aggression had contributed to the food export crisis, stating that, if Kyiv solves the problem of demining ports, the Russian Navy will ensure the unimpeded passage of ships with grain to the Mediterranean Sea. On June 30, 2022, Russia announced that it had withdrawn troops from the island in a gesture of goodwill. The withdrawal was later officially confirmed by Ukraine. Nuclear threats. 4 days into the invasion, President Putin placed Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, raising fears that Russia could use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, or a wider escalation of the conflict could occur. During April, Putin and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made a number of threats alluding to the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine and the countries supporting Ukraine. On April 14, CIA Director William Burns said that potential desperation in the face of defeat could encourage President Putin to use tactical nuclear weapons. In response to Russia's disregard of safety precautions during its occupation of the disabled former nuclear power plant at Chernobyl and its firing of missiles in the vicinity of the active nuclear power plant at Zaporizhzhia, on April 26 President Zelensky called for an international discussion on regulating Russia's use of nuclear resources, stating, "No one in the world can feel safe knowing how many nuclear facilities, nuclear weapons, and related technologies the Russian state has. If Russia has forgotten what Chernobyl is, it means that global control over Russia's nuclear facilities and nuclear technology is needed." In August, shelling around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant developed into a crisis, prompting an emergency inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Ukraine has described the crisis as an act of nuclear terrorism by Russia. On September 19, CNBC reported that Biden's response to Russian uncertainties about its lack of combat success in its invasion, stating, President Joe Biden warned of a consequential response from the U.S. if Russian President Vladimir Putin were to use nuclear or other non-conventional weapons. Asked what he would say to Putin if he was considering such action, Biden replied, Don't. don't. Following his statement made on September 19, Biden appeared before the United Nations on September 21 and continued his criticism of Putin's nuclear saber-rattling, stating that Putin was overt, reckless, and irresponsible. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Ukrainian resistance. Ukrainian civilians resisted the Russian invasion, volunteered for territorial defense units, made Molotov cocktails, donated food, built barriers such as Czech hedgehogs, and helped to transport refugees. Responding to a call from Ukraine's transportation agency, Ukrovtodor, civilians dismantled or altered road signs, constructed makeshift barriers, and blocked roadways. Social media reports showed spontaneous street protests against Russian forces in occupied settlements, often evolving into verbal altercations and physical standoffs with Russian troops. By the beginning of April, Ukrainian civilians began to organize as guerrillas, mostly in the wooded north and east of the country. The Ukrainian military announced plans to launch a large-scale guerrilla campaign to complement its conventional defense against the Russian invasion. People physically blocked Russian military vehicles, sometimes forcing them to retreat. The Russian soldiers' response to unarmed civilian resistance varied from reluctance to engage the protesters to firing into the air or directly into crowds. There have been mass detentions of Ukrainian protesters, and Ukrainian media reported forced disappearances, mock executions, hostage-taking, extrajudicial killing, and sexual violence perpetrated by the Russian military. To facilitate Ukrainian attacks, civilians reported Russian military positions via a telegram chatbot and Dia, a Ukrainian government app previously used by citizens to upload official identity and medical documents. In response, Russian forces began destroying mobile phone network equipment, searching door-to-door for smartphones and computers, and in at least one case killing a civilian found with pictures of Russian tanks. As of May 21, President Zelensky indicated that Ukraine had 700,000 service members on active duty combating the Russian invasion. Throughout 2022, Ukraine withdrew soldiers and military equipment deployed to United Nations peacekeeping missions, such as MONUSCO in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, back to Ukraine. Foreign involvement. Foreign military sales and aid. The Kiel Institute has tracked $84.2 billion from 40 countries in financial, humanitarian, and military aid to Ukraine from January 24 to August 3, 2022. NATO is coordinating and assisting member states in providing billions of dollars in military equipment and financial aid to Ukraine. The United States has provided the most military assistance, having provided $16.8 billion since February 2022. Many NATO allies, such as Germany and Sweden, have reversed past policies against providing offensive military aid in order to support Ukraine. The European Union for the first time in its history supplied lethal arms and has provided €2.5 billion to Ukraine. Between 2014 and 2021, the UK, US, EU, and NATO provided mostly non-lethal military aid to Ukraine. Lethal military support was initially limited. The US began to sell weapons including Javelin anti-tank missiles starting in 2018, and Ukraine agreed to purchase TB2 combat drones from Turkey in 2019. Russia built up equipment and troops on Ukraine's borders in January 2022. In response, the US worked with other NATO member states to transfer US-produced weapons to Ukraine. The UK also began to supply Ukraine with NLAW and Javelin anti-tank weapons. After the invasion, NATO member states including Germany agreed to supply weapons, but NATO as an organization did not. NATO and its members also refused to send troops into Ukraine, or to establish a no-fly zone, lest this spark a larger-scale war, a decision some labeled appeasement. On February 26, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced $350 million in lethal military assistance, including anti-armor and anti-aircraft systems. The next day the EU stated that it would purchase €450 million in lethal assistance and an additional €50 million in non-lethal supplies for Ukraine, with Poland handling distribution. During the first week of the invasion, NATO member states supplied more than 17,000 anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. By mid-March, the number was estimated to be more than 20,000. In 3 tranches agreed in February, March, and April 2022, the European Union committed to €1.5 billion to support the capabilities and resilience of the Ukrainian armed forces and the protection of the Ukrainian civilian population, under the purview of the European Peace Facility line. As of April 11, Ukraine had been provided with approximately 25,000 anti-air and 60,000 anti-tank weapon systems by the US and its allies. The following day, Russia reportedly received anti-tank missiles and RPGs from Iran, supplied through undercover networks via Iraq. On April 19, 2022, Romania announced a planned reform to the government decree that regulates the export of military weapons and national defense products to provide these weapons not only to NATO allies but also to Ukraine. The Ministry of Defense developed the draft decree stating that the reason behind this decision was Russia's aggression against Ukraine. However, on April 27 Defense Minister Vasile Dinko said that his plan had been discontinued. On April 26, the US convened a conference in which representatives of more than 40 countries met at the Ramstein Air Base to discuss military support for Ukraine. On April 28, U.S. President Biden asked Congress for an additional $33 billion to assist Ukraine, including $20 billion to provide weapons to Ukraine. On May 5, Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal announced that Ukraine had received more than $12 billion worth of weapons and financial aid from Western countries since the start of Russia's invasion on February 24. On May 10, the House passed legislation that would provide $40 billion in new aid to Ukraine. After the legislation was approved by the Senate, Biden signed the legislation on 21 May. On May 30, French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna announced the provision to Ukraine of additional Caesar self-propelled howitzer systems, mounted on the Renault Sherpa 5 6x6 chassis. On May 25, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine Valery Zaluzny said that the first batch was already on the front lines fighting the invader. On June 10, the AFU demonstrated the combat systems to representatives from the press. By that date the Ukrainian gunners possessed 18 Caesar units. On May 31, the White House informed the press that the U.S. would be supplying HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems to Ukraine. Some analysts had said HIMARS could be a game-changer in the war. Under-Secretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl stated that the U.S. would be able to send more systems as the fighting evolves. On June 10, an official from the Ukrainian military said that they were using 5,000 to 6,000 artillery rounds a day and would then be using 155 caliber NATO standard shells because all their Soviet-era guns had been destroyed. The official said the Russians had transformed the war into an artillery duel focused on the southeast of the country. On June 12, a Ukrainian presidential advisor put on Twitter a list of weapons that Ukraine needed to achieve heavy weapons parity. The top item was 1,000 howitzers caliber 155 mm. Ukraine claimed it had enough 155 mm ammunition but lacked the artillery to use it. According to Oryx Co., only 250 howitzers have been promised or delivered. On June 13, a Deutsche Welle correspondent said that the Ukrainian supply of Soviet-era ammunition had been exhausted and all they had was a dwindling supply obtained from friendly ex-Soviet countries. In June 2022 Germany declassified its list of military aid to Ukraine. By July 21, 2022, the EUCOM Control Center Ukraine/International Donor Coordination Center, a joint cell formed in March 2022, had trained 1,500 Ukrainian armed forces members on coalition-donated equipment. For the 16 US supplied HIMARS systems in Ukraine, the U.S. was providing more munitions at a cost of $550 million for the 17th Presidential Drawdown Package. The 18th U.S. Presidential Drawdown Package was released, a $1 billion package including additional HIMARS rocket pods, 75,000 rounds of 155 mm artillery ammunition, 2,120 mm mortar systems and 20,000 rounds of 120 mm mortar ammunition, National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, 1,000 javelins, and hundreds of AT-4 anti-tank weapons, 50 armored medical treatment vehicles, Claymore mines, C4 explosives, and medical supplies. The 19th U.S. Presidential Drawdown Package was a $775 million package, which included additional HIMARS rocket pods, 16 105 mm howitzers with 36,000 artillery rounds, 1,000 anti-armor javelins, 2,000 anti-armor rounds which are for the Swedish Carl Gustaf 8.4 cm recoilless rifle, 1,500 tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided anti-tank missiles, additional AGM-88 HARM air-launched, 417 anti-radiation missiles which home on radar sites, 15 Scan Eagles, 40 mine flail vehicles to clear out minefields, 50 Humvees, tactical secure communication systems, demolition munitions, night vision devices, thermal imagery systems, optics, and laser rangefinders. The packages since 2021 totaled $10.7 billion by August 19, 2022. As of July 2022, CNN reported on American recent declassified intel suggested that Iranians have given Shahid 129 UAV combat drones to Russian forces. In 2022, 800 combat drones manufactured by the Taiwanese Drones Vision were transferred to Ukraine through Poland. Ukraine Security Assistance Package on August 24, 2022, Aid for Longer-Term Requirements by Ukraine. $3 billion in U.S. security assistance was from a congressional funding source rather than by drawdown from U.S. government stocks. Instead, the ammunition, and other materiel, such as Scan Eagle and Puma drones, and Vampire counter-drone missiles would be from suppliers. The longer-term deliveries of materiel will include 6 additional NASAMS air defense units and their attendant rounds, up to 245,155 mm howitzer shells, up to 65,120 mm mortar rounds, up to 24 counter-battery radars, and the attendant training, maintenance, and sustainment. By August 24, 2022, U.S. aid since January 2021 exceeded $13.50 billion. By August 2022, the United Kingdom had provided military aid to the value of £2.3 bn. This included 3 M270 multiple launch rocket systems, some 5,000 NLAW anti-tank missiles, hundreds of Brimstone missiles, 120 armored vehicles including Mastiff protected patrol vehicles, and heavy-lift drones. Additionally, 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers were in an intensive 120-day infantry training course at 4 bases in Britain, delivered by a multinational team of trainers. On September 8, 2022, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken announced $2 billion in aid to Ukraine and 18 partners in the defense industrial base. In addition, U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin announced the 20th drawdown package up to $675 million for Ukraine military aid at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting in Germany, as well as discussion of initiatives for the respective industrial bases of the Defense Contact Group, in order to defend Ukraine's sovereign territory for the long haul. On September 28, William LaPlante, U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, met in Brussels with 40 counterparts in the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. On the agenda was the identification of industrial suppliers of replacement materiel such as gun barrels, ball bearings, steel casings, and microchips, without which the existing military aid will eventually cease to function due to heavy use on the battlefield. On September 15, 2022, U.S. President Biden announced his 21st drawdown package, worth $600 million in military aid to Ukraine in light of the 2022 Ukrainian Kharkiv counteroffensive. On September 28, 2022, the U.S. Department of Defense announced a USAI package worth up to $1.1 billion, which will purchase 18 additional HIMARS systems and their associated rockets from vendors in the future. By September 28, 16 HIMARS systems drawn from the US and an additional 10 equivalent systems from the Allies were in service in Ukraine. This USAI package was also to include 150 Humvees, 150 tactical vehicles, 20 multi-mission radars, explosive ordnance disposal equipment, body armor, and tactical secure communications systems, surveillance systems and optics. Training for Ukrainian troops, maintenance, and sustainment were included in this long-term package, totaling $16.2 billion in aid since the beginning of the 2022 invasion. Proposal for a Kyiv Security Compact. In September 2022, former NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen delivered a proposal for a long-lasting Kyiv Security Compact to President Volodymyr Zelensky, on legally binding security guarantees for Ukraine from a coalition of Western countries to bolster its ability to fend off Russian attacks through extensive joint training, the provision of advanced defense weapons systems, and support to develop the country's own defense industrial base. Lend-Lease for Ukraine. On October 1, 2022, Lend-Lease for Ukraine came into effect. A proposal to administer U.S. security assistance as part of EUCOM is under consideration at the Pentagon. This plan would systematize the services currently being provided to Ukraine on an ad hoc basis, and would provide a long-term vehicle for countering Russian plans under the provisions of the Lend-Lease Act, and for coordinating Allied aid for Ukraine's defense with Ukrainian requests at a single point of contact in Wiesbaden, Germany. On October 4, 2022, the 22nd presidential drawdown from U.S. stocks to Ukraine, $625 million in security assistance, included a tailored package, for more HIMARS systems and their associated rockets, 16 more M777 155mm howitzers and 75,155mm rounds, 500 M982 Excalibur precision-guided 155mm rounds, 1,155mm rounds of remote anti-armor mine systems, 16 more 105mm M119 howitzers, 30,120mm mortar rounds, 200 mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles, 200,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, and claymore mines. The package responds to current Ukrainian ammunition consumption rates during their latest offensives. More aid is forthcoming, according to Laura Cooper, a U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. So far, the security assistance has totaled $16.8 billion to Ukraine. On October 14, 2022, the 23rd presidential drawdown from U.S. stocks provided Ukraine $725 million in security assistance, including additional rounds for high-mobility artillery rocket systems, 23,155mm howitzer rounds, 500 precision-guided 155mm artillery rounds, 5,155mm rounds of remote anti-armor mine systems, 5,000 anti-tank weapons, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, more than 200 high-mobility multipurpose wheeled vehicles, small arms, and more than 2 million rounds of small arms ammunition, and medical supplies. So far, the security assistance has totaled $18.2 billion to Ukraine since January 2021. On October 17, 2022, the European Union approved €500 million in weapons for Ukraine, and a 2-year training mission under the command of Vice Admiral Hervé Blegin for 15,000 Ukrainian troops, initially. The training, at the individual, collective, and specialized levels, would be held in Germany and Poland, and would be open to other nations as well. The planned training cost would be nearly €107 million. Aid in construction of a missile defense system. Missile defense of Ukraine was arriving piecemeal. In Brussels on October 12, 2022, U.S. Army General Mark Milley suggested to the Ukraine Defense Contact Group that the allies of Ukraine chip in to help Ukraine rebuild and sustain an integrated air and missile defense system from the contributed air and missile defense system materiel. Specifically, Ukraine would need to link together and integrate their existing materiel and radars with command and control and communication systems. Minute 2025 On October 28, 2022, the Pentagon announced the 24th presidential drawdown of materiel worth $275 million. The security assistance has totaled $18.5 billion to Ukraine since January 2021. The aid includes 500 Excalibur precision-guided 155 mm artillery rounds, 2,155 mm remote anti-armor mine systems, more than 1,300 anti-armor weapons, more than 2.75 million rounds of small arms ammunition, more HIMARS rockets, 125 Humvees, and 4 satellite communications antennas for Ukraine's command and control systems, as well as training for operation of the NASAMS units, which are expected to arrive in Ukraine in November 2022. Foreign military involvement. Although NATO and the EU have publicly taken a strict policy of no boots on the ground in support against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the United States has significantly increased the secret involvement of Special Operations military and CIA operatives in support of Ukrainian forces since the beginning of the invasion. In addition, Ukraine has actively sought volunteers from other countries. On March 1, Ukraine temporarily lifted visa requirements for foreign volunteers who wished to join the fight against Russian forces. The move came after Zelensky created the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine and called on volunteers to join the defense of Ukraine, Europe, and the world. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba stated that as of March 6, approximately 20,000 foreign nationals from 52 countries have volunteered to fight. Most of these volunteers joined the newly created International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine. On June 9, the Donetsk People's Republic sentenced 3 foreign volunteers to death. 2 of them were British citizens and 1 was a Moroccan national. The foreign prisoners were later released. On March 3, Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov warned that mercenaries are not entitled to protection under the Geneva Conventions, and captured foreign fighters would not be considered prisoners of war, but prosecuted as criminals. Shortly thereafter, however, on March 11, Moscow announced that 16,000 volunteers from the Middle East were ready to join other pro-Russian foreign fighters alongside the Donbas separatists. A video uploaded online showed armed Central African paramilitaries preparing to fight in Ukraine with Russian troops. On October 21, a White House press release stated that Iranian troops were in Crimea assisting Russia in launching drone attacks. Foreign sanctions and ramifications. Western countries and others imposed limited sanctions on Russia when it recognized Donbas as an independent nation. When the attack began, many other countries applied sanctions intended to cripple the Russian economy. The sanctions targeted individuals, banks, businesses, monetary exchanges, bank transfers, exports, and imports. The sanctions cut major Russian banks from SWIFT, the global messaging network for international payments, but left some limited accessibility to ensure the continued ability to pay for gas shipments. Sanctions also included asset freezes on the Russian Central Bank, which holds $630 billion in foreign exchange reserves, to prevent it from offsetting the impact of sanctions, and froze the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. By March 1, total Russian assets frozen by sanctions amounted to $1 trillion. Kristalina Georgieva, managing director of the International Monetary Fund, warned that the conflict posed a substantial economic risk both regionally and internationally. The IMF could help other countries affected, she said, in addition to the $2.2 billion loan package for Ukraine. David Malpass, president of the World Bank Group, warned of far-reaching economic and social effects, and reported that the bank was preparing options for significant economic and fiscal support to Ukraine and the region. Economic sanctions affected Russia from the first day of the invasion, with its stock market falling by up to 39%. The Russian ruble fell to record lows, and Russians rushed to exchange currency. Stock exchanges in Moscow and St. Petersburg closed until at least March 18, the longest closure in Russia's history. On February 26, S&P Global Ratings downgraded the Russian government credit rating to junk, causing funds that require investment-grade bonds to dump Russian debt, making further borrowing very difficult for Russia. On April 11, S&P Global placed Russia under selective default on its foreign debt for insisting on payments in rubles. Dozens of corporations, including Unilever, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, Hermes, Chanel, and Prada ceased trading in Russia. Peace talks and stability of international borders were discussed during the week of May 9 within both Sweden and Finland when their parliaments applied to become full members of NATO. On March 24, Joe Biden's administration issued an executive order, which barred the sale of Russian gold reserves by U.S. citizens. Other G7 leaders took similar action. Gold has been one of Russia's major avenues to protect its economy from the impact of the sanctions imposed since the 2014 annexation of Crimea. In April 2022, Russia supplied 45% of EU's natural gas imports, earning $900 million a day. Russia is the world's largest exporter of natural gas, grains, and fertilizers, and among the world's largest suppliers of crude oil, coal, steel, and metals, including palladium, platinum, gold, cobalt, nickel, and aluminium. In May 2022, the European Commission proposed a ban on oil imports from Russia. With European policymakers deciding to replace Russian fossil fuel imports with other fossil fuels imports and European coal energy production, as well as due to Russia being a key supplier of materials used for clean energy technologies, the reactions to the war may also have an overall negative impact on the climate emissions pathway. Due to the sanctions imposed on Russia, Moscow is now looking to capitalize on alternative trade routes as the country has practically broken all logistic corridors for trade. The Russia-EU gas dispute flared up in March 2022. On June 14, Russia's Gazprom announced that it would be slashing gas flow via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, due to what it claimed to be Siemens' failure to return on time compressor units that had been sent off to Canada for repair. The explanation was challenged by Germany's energy regulator. On June 17, President Putin spoke to investors at St. Petersburg International Economic Forum about economic sanctions, saying that the economic blitzkrieg against Russia had no chance of succeeding from the very beginning. He further claimed that the sanctions would hurt the countries imposing them more than they would hurt Russia, calling the restrictions mad and thoughtless. He said to the investors, "Invest here. It's safer in your own house." Those who didn't want to listen to this have lost millions abroad. In response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Estonia has removed a remaining Soviet-era monument from a square in Narva. After its removal, Estonia was subject to the most extensive cyber attack since the 2007 cyber attacks on Estonia. On August 25, 2022, President Zelensky thanked President Biden for the $3 billion USAI security aid package, as well as the $3 billion World Bank financial aid package for Ukraine. On September 2, President Biden requested $13.7 billion for equipment, intelligence support, and direct budgetary support to Ukraine from Congress. Foreign condemnation and protest. The invasion received widespread international condemnation and protests occurred around the world. On March 2, the United Nations General Assembly passed UNGA Resolution ES-11/1 condemning the invasion and demanding a full withdrawal of Russian forces. The International Court of Justice ordered Russia to suspend military operations, and the Council of Europe expelled Russia. Many countries imposed sanctions on Russia, which have affected the economies of Russia and the world, and provided humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. The International Criminal Court opened an investigation into crimes against humanity in Ukraine since 2013, as well as war crimes in the 2022 invasion. Casualties and refugee crisis. Field casualties and injuries. Combat deaths can be inferred from a variety of sources, including satellite imagery and video footage of military actions. Both Russian and Ukrainian sources are widely considered to inflate casualty numbers in opposing forces, while downplaying their own losses for the sake of morale. Russian news outlets have largely stopped reporting the Russian death toll. Russia and Ukraine admitted to suffering significant and considerable losses, respectively. BBC News reported in April 2022 that Ukrainian claims of Russian fatalities included the injured as well. Agence France Presse, as well as independent conflict monitors, reported that they had not been able to verify Russian and Ukrainian claims of enemy losses, but suspected they were inflated. The number of civilian and military deaths is impossible to determine with precision given the fog of war. On October 12, 2022, the independent Russian media project Istorise reported that more than 90,000 Russian soldiers had been killed, seriously wounded, or gone missing in Ukraine, citing sources close to the Kremlin. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights considers the number of civilian casualties to be considerably higher than the figure the United Nations has been able to certify. On June 16, the Ukrainian Minister of Defense told CNN that he believed tens of thousands of Ukrainians had died, adding that he hoped that the true death toll was below 100,000. In the destroyed city of Mariupol alone, Ukrainian officials believe at least 22,000 have been killed, but investigations of morgue records indicate many more, while still more bodies remain uncollected. According to the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, 5 Syrian fighters were killed in Kherson. Prisoners of war. Official statistics and estimates of prisoners of war have varied. In the initial stages of the invasion, on February 24, Oksana Markarova, Ukraine's ambassador to the U.S., said that a platoon of the 74th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade from Kemerovo Oblast surrendered, saying they were unaware that they had been brought to Ukraine and tasked with killing Ukrainians. Russia claimed to have captured 572 Ukrainian soldiers by March 2, 2022, while Ukraine claimed 562 Russian soldiers were being held as prisoners as of March 20, with 10 previously reported released in a prisoner exchange for 5 Ukrainian soldiers, and the mayor of Melitopol. A report by The Independent on June 9 cited an intelligence report estimating that more than 5,600 Ukrainian soldiers had been captured, while the number of Russian servicemen being held as prisoners had fallen to 550, from 900 in April, following several prisoner exchanges. In contrast, the Ukrainska Pravda newspaper claimed 1,000 Russian soldiers were being held as prisoners as of 20 June. The first large prisoner exchange took place on March 24, when 10 Russian and 10 Ukrainian soldiers, as well as 11 Russian and 19 Ukrainian civilian sailors, were exchanged. On April 1, 86 Ukrainian servicemen were exchanged for an unknown number of Russian troops. On August 25, research conducted by the Humanitarian Research Lab of the Yale School of Public Health and the Conflict Observatory was published, which reported the identification of some 21 filtration camps in and around Russian-controlled Donetsk Oblast, run by Russian and Russian allied forces and used for Ukrainian civilians, POWs, and other personnel. These camps were allegedly used for 4 main purposes: as registration points, as camps and other holding facilities for those awaiting registration, as interrogation centers, and as correctional colonies. At Olenivka prison, one of the identified camps, the disturbed earth seen in imagery was said by researchers to be consistent with graves. Kaveh Koshnud, a professor at the Yale School of Public Health, said, "Incommunicado detention of civilians is more than a violation of international humanitarian law. It represents a threat to the public health of those currently in the custody of Russia and its proxies." The conditions of confinement documented in this report allegedly include insufficient sanitation, shortages of food and water, cramped conditions, and reported acts consistent with torture. Refugee crisis. The war caused the largest refugee and humanitarian crisis within Europe since the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. The UN described it as the fastest growing such crisis since World War II. As Russia built up military forces along the Ukrainian border, many neighboring governments and aid organizations prepared for a mass displacement event in the weeks before the invasion. In December 2021, the Ukrainian defense minister estimated that an invasion could force 3 to 5 million people to flee their homes. In the first week of the invasion, the UN reported over 1 million refugees had fled Ukraine. This subsequently rose to over 7,405,590 by September 24, a reduction from over 8 million due to some refugees' return. On May 20, NPR reported that, following a significant influx of foreign military equipment into Ukraine, a significant number of refugees are seeking to return to regions of Ukraine which are relatively isolated from the invasion front in southeastern Ukraine. However, by May 3, another 8 million people were displaced inside Ukraine. Most refugees were women, children, the elderly, or people with disabilities. Most male Ukrainian nationals aged 18 to 60 were denied exit from Ukraine as part of mandatory conscription, unless they were responsible for the financial support of 3 or more children, single fathers, or were the parent/guardian of children with disabilities. Many Ukrainian men, including teenagers, in any case opted to remain in Ukraine to join the resistance. Regarding destinations, according to the UN High Commission for Refugees, as of May 13, there were 3,315,711 refugees in Poland, 901,696 in Romania, 594,664 in Hungary, 461,742 in Moldova, 415,402 in Slovakia, and 27,308 in Belarus, while Russia reported it had received over 800,104 refugees. As of March 23, over 300,000 refugees had arrived in the Czech Republic. Turkey has been another significant destination, registering more than 58,000 Ukrainian refugees as of March 22, and more than 58,000 as of April 25. The EU invoked the Temporary Protection Directive for the first time in its history, granting Ukrainian refugees the right to live and work in the EU for up to 3 years. According to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, massive deportation of over 1.3 million Ukrainian civilians by Russia have occurred, potentially constitute crimes against humanity. The OSCE and Ukraine have accused Russia of forcibly moving civilians to filtration centers in Russian-held territory, and then into Russia. Ukrainian sources have compared this policy to Soviet-era population transfers and Russian actions in the Chechen War of Independence. For instance, as of April 8, Russia claimed to have evacuated about 121,000 Mariupol residents to Russia. Also, on October 19, Russia announced the forced deportation of 60,000 civilians from areas around the line of contact in Kherson Oblast. RIA Novosti and Ukrainian officials said that thousands were dispatched to various centers and cities in Russia and Russian-occupied Ukraine, from which people were sent to economically depressed regions of Russia. In April, Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council Secretary Oleksiy Danilov said Russia planned to build concentration camps for Ukrainians in western Siberia, and that it likely planned to force prisoners build new cities in Siberia. A second refugee crisis created by the invasion and by the Russian government's suppression of human rights has been the flight of more than 300,000 Russian political refugees and economic migrants, the largest exodus from Russia since the October Revolution of 1917, to countries such as the Baltic states, Finland, Georgia, Turkey, and Central Asia. By March 22, it was estimated that between 50,000 and 70,000 high-tech workers had left the country, and that 70,000 to 100,000 more might follow. Fears arose in Russia over the effect of this flight of talent on economic development. Some Russian refugees sought to oppose Putin and help Ukraine from outside their country, and some faced discrimination for being Russian. There has also been an exodus of millionaires. On May 6, the Moscow Times, citing data from the FSB, reported that almost 4 million Russians had left the country, although this figure included travelers for business or tourism. Russia's partial mobilization of 300,000 men in September prompted an initial 200,000 more Russians to flee the country, rising to 400,000 by early October, double the number of those conscripted. As of October 3, 2022, the invasion has likely resulted in tens of thousands of deaths on both sides and caused Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II, with an estimated 8 million people being displaced within the country by late May, as well as 7.6 million Ukrainians fleeing the country as of October 3, 2022. Humanitarian impact. The humanitarian impact of the invasion has been extensive and has included negative impacts on international food supplies and the 2022 food crises. The invasion has also had a negative impact upon the cultural heritage of Ukraine. Reactions. The invasion received widespread international condemnation from governments and intergovernmental organizations, with political reactions including new sanctions imposed on Russia, which triggered widespread economic effects on the Russian and world economies. The European Union and other Western governments financed and delivered humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. The bloc also implemented various economic sanctions, including a ban on Russian aircraft using EU airspace, a swift ban on certain Russian banks, and a ban on certain Russian media outlets. Reactions to the invasion have varied considerably across a broad spectrum of concerns, including public response, media responses, peace efforts, and the examination of the legal implications of the invasion. The invasion received widespread public condemnation internationally, while in some countries, certain sectors expressed sympathy or outright support for Russia due in part to distrust of U.S. foreign policy. Protests and demonstrations were held worldwide, including some in Russia and parts of Ukraine occupied by Russia. Calls for a boycott of Russian goods spread on social media platforms, while hackers attacked Russian websites, particularly those operated by the Russian government. Anti-Russian sentiment against Russians living abroad surged after the invasion. See also 2020's commodities boom. 2022 in Russia. 2022 in Ukraine. List of interstate wars since 1945. List of invasions and occupations of Ukraine. List of military engagements during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. List of ongoing armed conflicts. List of wars between Russia and Ukraine. Post-Soviet conflicts. Timeline of the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine.